The leather chair creaked beneath me as I shifted uncomfortably in Harold Barnes' law office, watching my brother Ryan smooth his Italian silk tie for the third time in 5 minutes. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the gold face of his Rolex, sending little dancing reflections across the mahogany conference table where our entire family sat in anticipation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My mother, Patricia, had positioned herself directly across from Mr. Barnes, her back straight as a ruler, while my father, Tom, drummed his fingers silently against his knee in that nervous habit he'd had since I was little. I tucked my paint-stained fingers under my thighs, suddenly aware of how my thrift store cardigan looked next to Jessica's designer blazer. My sister-in-law kept glancing at her phone, probably checking on the kids with the babysitter, but there was something else in her expression too, something expectant, like she already knew what was coming. The air in the room felt thick with more than just the scent of old books and furniture polish. There was anticipation hanging between us, the kind that comes when money is about to change hands. My grandfather William had passed 3 weeks ago, and while we'd all mourned in our own ways, there was no denying that this moment had been lurking in everyone's minds since the funeral. Everyone's except mine, maybe. I'd already made peace with the fact that my artistic pursuits and community center job had likely written me out of any significant inheritance years ago. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat and opened the thick manila folder in front of him. His silver hair caught the light as he adjusted his reading glasses, and for a moment I was reminded of all the times I'd seen him at family gatherings over the years. Always polite, always professional, but there had been something different in the way he'd looked at me at the funeral. A kind of knowing sadness that I hadn't understood then. "Before we begin," he said in that measured voice that had probably delivered news both wonderful and terrible to countless families over the decades, "I want you all to know that William spent considerable time crafting these final wishes. Every decision was deliberate." The reading began exactly as I'd expected it would. Ryan received the investment portfolio first, and I watched his face transform as Mr. Barnes announced the figure, $5 million in carefully managed stocks and bonds. My brother's eyes widened, then quickly narrowed as he processed the number, probably already calculating the quarterly returns in his head. Jessica reached over to squeeze his hand, and I caught the small smile that passed between them. They'd been hoping, of course. Ryan had always been grandfather's favorite, or at least that's what everyone assumed. "Congratulations, son," my father whispered, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. Mom actually teared up, pressing her tissue to the corner of her eye in that delicate way she'd perfected over years of church services and PTA meetings. Next came the house on Oak Avenue, the one where I'd grown up, the one with the kitchen that still smelled like my mother's apple pie every Sunday. That went to my parents, along with grandfather's remaining savings account. Another substantial sum that would ensure their retirement was more comfortable than they'd ever dreamed. Mom actually gasped when she heard the number, and Dad's drumming fingers finally went still. I sat there in my creaking chair, genuinely happy for them. Ryan deserved security for his family, and my parents had worked hard their whole lives. Dad had spent 30 years selling insurance policies to neighbors and friends, always putting everyone else's needs before his own. Mom had managed the accounts at First National Bank until her retirement, meticulous with every penny that passed through her hands. They were good people who'd earned some ease in their golden years. But as the minutes ticked by and my name remained unmentioned, I felt that familiar hollow sensation settling in my stomach. The same feeling I'd had at every family dinner, where Ryan's latest promotion was celebrated while my art exhibitions went unmentioned. The same feeling from Christmas mornings when his expensive gifts were unwrapped with excitement, while my handmade presents were politely acknowledged and quickly set aside. I'd learned not to expect anything different. My choice to teach art to underprivileged kids at the Millbrook Community Center instead of pursuing what my family considered a real career had been met with the kind of disappointed silence that spoke louder than any argument ever could. When I'd turned down Ryan's offer to get me an entry-level position at his real estate development firm 3 years ago, the dinner table conversations had become noticeably cooler whenever my future came up. Still, Sitting there in that law office, I couldn't help but remember the grandfather who used to sneak me extra cookies when Mom wasn't looking. The one who'd never missed a single one of my art shows at school, even when my own parents found excuses to skip them. The grandfather who'd taught me how to mix paint colors in his basement workshop, his weathered hands guiding mine as we created shades that didn't exist in any store-bought set. Mr. Barnes shuffled through several more pages, his expression unreadable behind those wire-rimmed glasses. Finally, he looked up, and his eyes found mine across the table. "Emma Sullivan," he said, and my heart jumped even though I'd been expecting this moment. "Your grandfather left specific instructions regarding your inheritance." The room went completely silent. Even Jessica stopped checking her phone. "To my granddaughter Emma," Mr. Barnes read in that same steady voice, "who sees beauty where others see only function, and who creates wonder from the simplest materials, I leave this." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out something small, something that caught the afternoon light with a dull, greenish gleam. A key, old and tarnished, hanging from a piece of worn leather cord. As he placed it on the table in front of me, I could see the intricate pattern carved into its unusual octagonal head, and the small metal tag attached to the cord that read 1947 in faded numbers. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I stared at the key, this rusty piece of metal that looked like it might have fallen out of someone's junk drawer, while my brother sat across from me with $5 million worth of investment certificates spread in front of him like a winning poker hand. "Is that—" Ryan started, then stopped himself, but I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "That's it?" Mom's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet room it might as well have been a shout. Mr. Barnes nodded slowly. "There is also a letter," he said, reaching back into his briefcase, "with instructions that it be read aloud to the family." My hands were shaking as I reached for the key, the metal cold against my palm. The leather cord was soft with age, worn smooth by what must have been decades of handling. As I held it up to the light, I could see that the carving on the head wasn't random at all, but formed a pattern that looked almost like flowers, or maybe stars. It was hard to tell with all the tarnish. "The letter, please," my father said, and there was something in his tone that I'd never heard before, a kind of forced patience that suggested he was working very hard to keep his thoughts to himself. Mr. Barnes unfolded a single sheet of paper, the same cream-colored stationery that grandfather had always used for important correspondence. His handwriting was still strong and clear, despite his age. "My dear Emma," the letter began, and I felt my throat tighten as Mr. Barnes read in grandfather's words. "If you are hearing this, then you are holding the key to something that has been waiting for you your entire life. Your family will not understand its value, just as they have never understood yours. But you, my dear girl, have always seen treasure where others see only rust." I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I couldn't look up from the key in my hands. The metal was warming now from my touch, and I found myself running my thumb over the carved pattern, feeling each tiny groove and line. "This key opens what matters most," Mr. Barnes continued reading. "Not money, though there is that too. Not property, though you will have that as well. This key opens truth, Emma, and truth, as I have learned in my 87 years, is worth more than all the investments and real estate in the world." "Truth about what?" Jessica asked, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the office. Mr. Barnes looked at her, then back at the letter. "William has left specific instructions for Emma regarding the key's purpose, but those are in a sealed envelope to be opened privately. He was quite clear that this portion of his legacy was meant for her alone to discover." I finally looked up from the key to find my family staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Ryan's face was carefully neutral, but I could see the muscle in his jaw working the way it always did when he was trying not to say something he'd regret. Mom looked confused and a little hurt, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Dad just looked tired. "Well," Mom said finally, her voice artificially bright, "I'm sure Grandpa Bill had his reasons." But I could hear what she wasn't saying. I could hear it in the way she said reasons, like it was a foreign word she wasn't sure she believed in. I could see it in the way Ryan was studying the investment documents in front of him, as if he needed to reassure himself that his inheritance was real and substantial, and normal. The thing was, I couldn't blame them. Here was Ryan, who'd followed every rule, met every expectation, and built exactly the kind of life that our family valued. Successful career, beautiful wife, 2 kids, mortgage on a house in the best neighborhood in Millbrook. He'd earned his $5 million in every way that made sense to people like our parents. And here was me, sitting in a chair that didn't quite fit right, holding a rusty key that looked like something you'd find at a garage sale for 50 cents. Emma Sullivan, the granddaughter who'd chosen art over advancement, community service over career climbing, and passion over profit. The one who'd never quite figured out how to translate her dreams into the kind of success that looked good on Christmas cards. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of that small key in my palm, I remembered something else. I remembered the way grandfather's eyes used to light up when I showed him my latest drawing. I remembered how he'd always asked about my students at the community center, wanting to know not just their names but their stories, their struggles, their small victories. I remembered the way he'd nod thoughtfully when I talked about using art to help kids express feelings they couldn't put into words, as if he understood something about that kind of healing that the rest of the family didn't. Maybe this rusty key wasn't the consolation prize I'd first thought it was. Maybe, knowing my grandfather the way I did, it was something else entirely. Mr. Barnes was packing up his briefcase now, the official business concluded. Ryan was already on his phone, probably calling his financial advisor. Mom and Dad were whispering together about practical things like tax implications and estate planning. Jessica was back to checking her messages. But I just sat there, turning that old key over and over in my hands, wondering what door it was meant to open, and why my grandfather had trusted me, and only me, to find out. The ride home from the law office was quiet, except for the soft hum of Ryan's BMW, and the occasional rustle of papers, as Jessica organized the investment documents in her lap. I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar streets of Millbrook roll past through tinted windows that made everything look slightly gray and distant. The rusty key felt warm in my closed fist, and I found myself unconsciously rubbing my thumb across its tarnished surface, feeling the intricate carved pattern that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light hit it. Ryan had offered to drive me home, though I suspected it was more out of obligation than genuine concern. We'd always had that kind of relationship, where we performed the motions of being close siblings, without actually sharing much of anything real. He was 4 years older, and those 4 years had always felt like a canyon between us, especially after he'd married Jessica and started building the kind of life that made perfect sense to everyone in our family. So, Jessica said, turning slightly in the passenger seat to look back at me. That was unexpected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Expected. There was something in her tone that I couldn't quite place. Not unkind, exactly, but probing. Like she was trying to solve a puzzle, and I might be holding a piece she needed. I guess Grandpa Bill always was full of surprises, I replied, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Henderson watering her flower boxes outside the hardware store, the same routine she'd followed every weekday for as long as I could remember. Some things in Millbrook never changed, which had always been both comforting and suffocating in equal measure. But a key, Ryan said, his eyes finding mine in the rearview mirror. I mean, what's that supposed to open? Did he say anything to you about it? Before he passed, I mean. I shook my head, though that wasn't entirely true. Grandfather hadn't mentioned any key specifically, but there had been something different about our last conversation. It was 2 weeks before he died, when I'd stopped by to bring him some soup that Mom had made. He'd been sitting in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at the oak tree in his backyard, and when I'd asked what he was thinking about, he'd said something strange. "Just wondering what we leave behind, Emma girl," he'd said, using the nickname he'd had for me since I was small. Not the obvious things, the real things. The things that matter when all the counting is done. At the time, I'd thought he was just being philosophical in the way that old people sometimes get when they're facing their own mortality. But now, with this mysterious key burning a warm spot in my palm, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something more specific. Maybe it's symbolic, Jessica suggested. though she didn't sound convinced. You know how artistic types can be. Maybe it represents opportunity or potential or something like that. I bristled at being dismissed as an artistic type, but I'd learned over the years that responding to Jessica's casual condescension only made family gatherings more uncomfortable for everyone. She didn't mean to be cruel, I didn't think. She just lived in a world where everything had a clear market value, where success was measured in quarterly reports and portfolio growth, where a rusty key was either worth something concrete or it was essentially worthless. Could be, I said mildly, watching as we passed the community center where I taught my art classes. The building looked smaller from the comfort of Ryan's luxury car, more rundown than I usually noticed when I was walking up to it every morning with my canvas bag full of supplies and lesson plans. Through the large windows, I could see some of my evening students setting up their easels. Maria Gonzalez, who worked 2 jobs but never missed a Wednesday painting session. Tommy Chen, whose mother brought him even though art supplies stretched their grocery budget. Mrs. Patterson, whose arthritis made it hard to hold a brush, but who said creating something beautiful was worth the pain. These were the people who understood why I'd chosen community service over corporate success, who knew that some kinds of value couldn't be measured in investment returns. But sitting in that back seat, surrounded by the leather and technology and quiet luxury that Ryan's choices had afforded him, I felt the familiar tug of doubt. Maybe my family was right. Maybe I was just stubborn and impractical, turning my nose up at real opportunities in favor of feel-good projects that didn't actually change anything important. You know, Ryan said as we stopped at a red light, if you ever want to talk to my financial advisor about setting up some kind of investment plan, I could make an introduction. Even if the key thing doesn't pan out to be anything substantial, it's never too late to start building for the future. There it was again, that careful concern that felt more like pity than genuine care. Ryan had been making these kinds of offers for years, always framing them as helpful suggestions rather than criticisms of my life choices. When I'd first started teaching at the community center, he'd sent me job listings for corporate training positions that paid 3 times my salary. When I'd moved into my small studio apartment above the coffee shop, he'd offered to help me qualify for a mortgage on a real place in his neighborhood. When I'd turned 30 without getting married, he'd started including me in dinner invitations where single male colleagues just happened to be present. All of it came from a place of love, I knew that. Ryan genuinely wanted me to be happy, but his definition of happiness looked a lot like his own life. Secure income, suburban house, retirement planning, and a clear path toward accumulating more of all those things. The fact that I'd found a different kind of satisfaction in my work, a different kind of purpose in helping kids discover their own creative voices, didn't translate into anything he could understand or value. That's sweet of you, I said, and meant it even though I had no intention of taking him up on the offer. But I'm doing okay. Jessica turned around again, and this time her expression was softer. We just worry about you sometimes, Emma. Living alone in that tiny apartment, working for practically nothing at the community center, don't you ever want more? The question hit harder than it should have, maybe because it was one I'd been asking myself lately. Not about money or status exactly, but about impact. About whether the small difference I was making in the lives of my students was enough to justify the larger distance it had created between me and my family. About whether choosing passion over profit had been brave or just naive. I like my life, I said, and mostly that was true. I loved my students. Loved the moment when a shy teenager finally found the courage to share their artwork with the class. Loved the way art could help people express things they couldn't say with words. I loved the diversity of the community center, the way it brought together people from all over Millbrook who might never cross paths otherwise. I loved the creative freedom that came with not having to worry about corporate hierarchies or profit margins. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't moments when I felt the weight of being different, of being the family member who couldn't be easily explained or categorized. When my high school classmates posted photos of their new houses and family vacations on social media, when my parents' friends asked what I was doing with my life, in tones that suggested my current answer wasn't quite adequate, when I had to decline invitations because my budget couldn't stretch to cover restaurant dinners or weekend trips, the light turned green and we continued through downtown Millbrook, past the closed-up storefronts that had once housed thriving businesses before the factory jobs started disappearing. The town had been built around Sullivan Manufacturing and the 3 other factories that had employed most of the families here for generations. When those jobs went overseas in the early 2000s, Millbrook had struggled to reinvent itself. Some people, like Ryan, had found ways to build new kinds of success. Others had left for bigger cities with more opportunities. And some, like me, had stayed and tried to help the community adapt and heal. Maybe that's why Grandfather's gift felt so significant, even if I couldn't understand it yet. He'd built Sullivan Manufacturing from nothing, created hundreds of jobs, supported countless families for decades. When he'd finally sold the company and retired, he'd watched the new owners gradually move operations to cheaper locations, until all that was left was an empty building, and a lot of people wondering what came next. I'd always suspected that losing the factory had broken something in him, not financially but spiritually. He'd spent his whole life believing that hard work and good intentions were enough to build something lasting, something that would take care of people long after he was gone. Watching that legacy crumble had changed him in ways that were hard to put into words. But maybe this key was his way of trying to build a different kind of legacy, something that couldn't be sold or moved or dissolved by market forces. Something that would matter in ways that quarterly reports couldn't measure. We pulled up in front of the Daily Grind, the coffee shop below my apartment, and I could see the warm light spilling out of the windows onto the sidewalk. Through the glass, I caught a glimpse of Ben Martinez, the owner, wiping down tables at the end of another long day. He always stayed late on Thursdays because the community center art classes let out at 8, and several of my students liked to come by for coffee and conversation afterward. It was one of those small kindnesses that made Millbrook feel like home, the way people looked out for each other without making a big deal about it. "Thanks for the ride," I said, already reaching for the door handle. "Emma, wait," Ryan said, turning around to face me directly. "Look, I know we don't always see eye to eye on things, but I want you to know that Jessica and I are proud of what you do. The art classes, working with kids, all of it. It's important work, even if it doesn't pay well." There was sincerity in his voice, and I felt a sudden rush of affection for my brother. For all our differences, for all the ways our choices had taken us in opposite directions, he was trying to bridge the gap between us. It wasn't his fault that his attempts sometimes felt more like charity than understanding. "I know you are," I said. "And I'm proud of you too. The business you've built, the family you have. You've done good, Ryan." He smiled, and for a moment he looked like the big brother who used to help me reach the cookie jar when Mom wasn't looking. "If you figure out what that key opens, will you let us know? I'm curious despite myself." "I will," I promised, though something in my gut told me that whatever secret the key unlocked, it might not be the kind of thing that could be easily shared or explained. I climbed out of the car and watched them drive away, Ryan's taillights disappearing around the corner toward his neighborhood, where every house had a 2-car garage and professionally maintained landscaping. Then I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, the key still warm in my hand, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. My studio apartment was small, but it was mine, filled with canvases and art supplies, and the kind of comfortable clutter that comes from actually using a space for living rather than displaying. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Most of the shops were closed now, their security lights casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. This was the Millbrook that I loved, the one that existed after business hours when the real life of the community emerged. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Kowalski would unlock the bakery at 5 a.m. and start preparing the day's bread. By 6, the construction workers would be lined up for coffee and donuts before heading to job sites around town. By 7, parents would be hurrying past with children in tow, everyone rushing towards schools and workplaces, and the thousand small errands that keep a town functioning. And somewhere in all of that ordinary life, there was a door that this rusty key was meant to open. A secret that my grandfather had trusted me, and only me, to discover. As I sat there in my small apartment, surrounded by my modest possessions and my uncertain future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. The thrilling possibility that everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I found myself lying in bed, turning the rusty key over and over in my hands, studying every detail of its unusual octagonal shape and the intricate carved pattern that seemed to tell a story I couldn't yet read. The metal had warmed to my touch, and in the dim light filtering through my apartment windows, the tarnished surface seemed to shift between green and gold, like it was hiding secrets beneath its weathered exterior. By morning, I'd made a decision. I couldn't spend another day wondering what door this key was meant to open. The sealed envelope from Mr. Barnes sat unopened on my kitchen counter, grandfather's final instructions waiting to be discovered. But something told me I needed to do some investigating of my own first. If this key meant something important, if it really was valuable in ways my family couldn't understand, then I owed it to myself and to grandfather's memory to find out what that was. I called in sick to the community center, something I'd done maybe 3 times in the 5 years I'd been teaching there. Angela Foster, the director, was understanding as always, telling me to take care of myself and not to worry about the Thursday morning session with the senior citizens. But I could hear the concern in her voice, and I promised myself I'd make up some excuse later about a 24-hour bug or something equally harmless. The truth was, I couldn't focus on teaching art to Mrs. Patterson and her friends when this mystery was burning a hole in my thoughts. I needed answers, and I had a feeling that those answers weren't going to be found in any letter or legal document. They were going to be found in the places where my grandfather had actually lived his life. My first stop was the Millbrook Public Library, housed in a beautiful old Carnegie building that had been the pride of the town since 1902. Sarah Chen, the head librarian and someone I'd known since elementary school, looked up from her computer terminal with a smile when I walked through the heavy oak doors. "Emma Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying that particular warmth that librarians reserve for people who actually appreciate books. "I haven't seen you here during school hours in forever. Playing hooky?" "Something like that," I said, glancing around at the familiar high ceilings and tall windows that made even ordinary research feel important. "Sarah, I need to ask you about something, and it might sound a little strange." She raised an eyebrow but gestured for me to continue. Sarah had always been the kind of person who took questions seriously, no matter how odd they might seem on the surface. "Do you have any historical records about keys?" I asked, pulling the rusty key from my pocket and placing it carefully on the circulation desk. "Specifically, keys that might have been made in 1947, based on this tag here." Sarah picked up the key and examined it closely, turning it toward the light streaming through the library windows. "This is beautiful craftsmanship," she said, running her finger along the carved pattern. "See these markings? This isn't machine-made. Someone hand-carved this design, and they knew what they were doing." "So it's old?" "Oh yes, definitely from that era, maybe earlier." She looked up at me with curiosity bright in her eyes. "Where did you get this, if you don't mind me asking?" I explained about the will reading, about grandfather's unusual bequest, about the way my family had reacted to what they saw as essentially a worthless trinket. As I talked, Sarah's expression grew more and more thoughtful. "Emma," she said when I finished, "your grandfather was one of our most frequent visitors here, especially in his later years. After he retired from the factory, he spent hours in our local history section, researching old town records, looking through archived newspapers. I always assumed he was working on some kind of family genealogy project." My heart started beating faster. What kind of records was he looking at? Everything. Property deeds, business licenses, old maps of the town. He was particularly interested in buildings that had been constructed in the 1940s and 1950s. She paused, studying the key again. "You know what? Let me show you something." Sarah led me through the library to a section I'd never paid much attention to before, filled with filing cabinets and bound volumes of local newspapers dating back to the town's founding. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Millbrook Construction Records 1940 to 1960 and spread several photocopied documents across a reading table. "Your grandfather made copies of all of these," she said, pointing to official-looking forms with elaborate letterhead. "Building permits, architectural plans, city planning documents. Look at this one." The document she showed me was a building permit dated September 15, 1947, for the construction of Secure Storage Facility, Sullivan Manufacturing Company. The address listed was on the outskirts of town, in an area I knew had been industrial back then, but was mostly overgrown fields now. A storage facility? I asked, my pulse quickening. There's more, Sarah said, pulling out another document. This one was a bank record showing a large payment made to something called Morrison Security Solutions in October 1947. The payment was signed by William Sullivan and marked Installation Private Vault System, Morrison Security Solutions. I recognized that name from somewhere, and it took me a moment to place it. Frank Morrison had been grandfather's business partner in the early days of Sullivan Manufacturing, before they'd had some kind of falling out that split the company. I'd heard whispers about it over the years at family gatherings, but no one ever talked about what had actually happened between them. Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, do you think this key might open something at that storage facility? She looked at the documents, then at the key, then back at me. Emma, I think your grandfather spent the last 15 years of his life preparing for something, and I think you're holding the key to what that was. I borrowed the folder from Sarah, promising to return it by the end of the week, and drove out to the address listed on the building permit. The road that had once led to Sullivan Manufacturing's storage facility was barely more than a dirt track now, overgrown with weeds and marked only by a rusted gate that hung open on broken hinges. I parked my old Honda at the side of the road and walked through the gate, following what remained of a gravel driveway toward a structure that was almost completely hidden by 15 years of unchecked vegetation. As I pushed through the tangle of wild roses and Virginia creeper, I could make out the shape of a small concrete building, maybe 20 feet square, with no windows and a single heavy door. The door was solid steel, painted green once but now mostly rust, and in the center was a lock that made my breath catch in my throat. It was octagonal, just like the head of the key in my pocket, with the same intricate pattern carved around its edges. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the key. This was it. This was what grandfather had wanted me to find. But as I approached the door, I noticed something else that made me stop short. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Recent footprints around the building's perimeter. Someone else had been here, and not very long ago. I looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how isolated this place was, how no one knew where I'd gone. But the key was warm in my hand, and I could almost hear grandfather's voice encouraging me forward. Truth, Emma, he'd said in his letter. This key opens truth. I slid the key into the lock, and it turned as smoothly as if it had been oiled yesterday. The heavy door swung open, with barely a sound, and I found myself staring into a space that took my breath away. It wasn't just a storage facility. It was a vault, with reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my head. But what made me gasp wasn't the construction. It was what filled the space. Rows upon rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, each one labeled with dates and categories that I couldn't make sense of from where I stood. In the center of the room was a large desk, and spread across its surface were documents, photographs, and what looked like architectural drawings. But it was the wall directly across from the door that made my knees weak. It was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, connected by red string like something out of a detective movie. Pictures of buildings, of people, of newspaper clippings, and official documents. And in the center of it all, a photograph of Frank Morrison, shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize, both of them standing in front of what looked like Sullivan Manufacturing. I stepped into the vault, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls, and approached the desk. The documents spread across its surface were legal papers, contracts, financial records, all bearing dates from the late 1940s and early 1950s. As I began to read, the story they told made my stomach turn. Frank Morrison hadn't just been grandfather's business partner. He'd been stealing from Sullivan Manufacturing almost from the beginning, skimming money from contracts, selling company secrets to competitors, using his position to build his own competing business while grandfather trusted him completely. The evidence was all here, meticulously documented and cross-referenced. a paper trail that would have destroyed Morrison's reputation and probably sent him to prison. But there was more. As I dug deeper into the files, I found correspondence between Morrison and several other Millbrook business leaders. Evidence of a conspiracy to drive Sullivan Manufacturing out of business so they could buy up the company's assets for pennies on the dollar. They'd systematically sabotaged contracts, spread rumors about the company's financial stability, even bribed city officials to deny crucial permits and licenses. The final piece of the puzzle was a folder labeled "The Real Reason," and inside it was a confession letter written in grandfather's own handwriting. He'd known. He'd known about Morrison's betrayal, about the conspiracy, about all of it. But he'd also known that fighting it would have destroyed not just Morrison and his conspirators, but dozens of innocent families who worked for those businesses. So he'd chosen to keep quiet, to sell the company and retire, letting everyone believe that Sullivan Manufacturing had simply failed to adapt to changing markets. I sank into the chair behind the desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My grandfather, the man my family remembered as a successful businessman who'd built something great and then gracefully retired, had actually been the victim of systematic betrayal and corruption. He'd sacrificed his own reputation, his own legacy, to protect people who would never even know what he'd done for them. But why had he kept all this evidence? Why spend 15 years maintaining this secret vault, preserving documents that would have vindicated him if he'd ever chosen to use them? The answer was in the final folder I opened, labeled simply, "For Emma." Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before his death, written in the shaky handwriting that had marked his final years. "My dear Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've found the truth I couldn't bear to share while I was alive. Frank Morrison and his friends took everything I built, but they couldn't take what I learned from losing it. They couldn't take the knowledge that real legacy isn't measured in dollars or buildings or newspaper headlines. It's measured in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the kindness we show when there's nothing to gain, in the courage to do what's right even when it costs us everything." I wiped tears from my cheeks, tears I hadn't realized I was crying. "I'm leaving this evidence to you because you're the only one in our family who understands that some things are worth more than money. Morrison is still alive, still living off the fortune he stole from us, and from this town. His son runs the Morrison Development Company now, the same company that's been buying up properties all over Millbrook for the past 5 years, driving out small businesses and turning our community into just another generic suburb." My blood ran cold. Morrison Development Company, I knew that name. They were the ones who'd been trying to buy the community center, offering the city council amounts that would be hard to refuse. They were the ones behind the luxury apartment complex that had displaced 3 local businesses. They were the ones who'd torn down the old Kowalski family bakery to build a chain coffee shop that had lasted exactly 8 months before closing. "The evidence in this vault," grandfather's letter continued, "is enough to expose everything Morrison and his family have built on stolen foundations. But using it comes with a price. It means choosing justice over peace, truth over comfort. It means accepting that some fights are worth having even when you can't win them cleanly." I looked around the vault again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a storage facility. It was a weapon, carefully maintained and perfectly preserved, waiting for someone with the courage to use it. And my grandfather, the man who'd taught me to see beauty in broken things and value in forgotten places, had trusted me to decide whether that weapon should ever see the light of day. As I sat there in that hidden room, surrounded by 15 years of carefully documented injustice, I realized that my inheritance wasn't just a rusty key and a mysterious letter. It was a choice. A choice between letting sleeping dogs lie and waking up the whole kennel. A choice between protecting my family's comfortable ignorance and exposing a truth that would change everything for everyone. And for the first time since sitting in Harold Barnes's office yesterday, watching my brother receive his $5 million while I got what everyone thought was junk, I understood exactly what my grandfather had really given me. He'd given me the power to rewrite history, to reclaim not just his stolen legacy but the future of our entire town. The question was, did I have the courage to use it? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.